What drives a soldier to feed the children of his enemy? In the spring of 1945, as American forces swept across a devastated Germany, they encountered a humanitarian catastrophe that would test the very foundations of military doctrine and human compassion. Starving civilians, hollow-eyed children, and desperate mothers lined the streets of conquered cities, their gaunt faces telling stories of deprivation that transcended the boundaries of war. The question facing every American soldier was not simply how to win the war, but how to remain human in its aftermath. This is the story of an extraordinary moment in history when the machinery of war ground to a halt before the face of human suffering. When American troops, many of them barely more than boys themselves, made choices that defied military logic and sometimes even orders. When the line between victor and vanquished blurred in the shared recognition of humanity's most basic needs, it is a story that challenges our understanding of warfare, occupation, and the capacity for compassion in the darkest of times. The spring of 1945 marks one of history's most complex moral landscapes. As Allied forces penetrated deeper into the Third Reich, they discovered a population teetering on the edge of mass starvation. The Nazi regime's total war economy had cannibalized every resource, leaving German civilians to face a catastrophe of their own government's making. Yet these were the same civilians who had supported, actively or passively, a regime responsible for unprecedented atrocities. The same nation whose armies had laid waste to Europe now stood helpless, waiting to see what mercy their conquerors might show. The Germany that American forces entered in early 1945 bore little resemblance to the militaristic powerhouse that had terrorized Europe for 6 years. Allied bombing campaigns had systematically destroyed German cities, transforming vibrant urban centers into landscapes of rubble and ash. Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, Frankfurt, each name represented not just a strategic target, but a humanitarian catastrophe in the making. The bombing had done more than destroy buildings. It had shattered the infrastructure that sustained civilian life. By March 1945, the German food distribution system had collapsed entirely. Transportation networks lay in ruins, with railways destroyed and roads cratered by bombs and artillery. Agricultural regions in the east had fallen to Soviet forces, cutting off Germany's breadbasket. The winter of 1944-1945 had been particularly brutal, depleting what meager reserves remained. Food stocks that might have sustained the population for months had been consumed, hoarded, or destroyed in the chaos of retreat. The Nazi regime's response to impending defeat had been characteristically ruthless. Rather than acknowledge the humanitarian crisis facing German civilians, authorities had maintained the fiction of ultimate victory until the very end. Resources continued to flow to military units, even as cities starved. When local officials attempted to distribute remaining food stocks to prevent mass starvation, they often faced execution for defeatism. The regime that had promised prosperity had delivered its people to the brink of annihilation. American military planners faced an unprecedented dilemma as their armies advanced. The Geneva Convention required occupying forces to maintain public order and prevent starvation. But US forces were not prepared for the scale of the humanitarian crisis they encountered. Initial directives reflected the harsh realities of war. Germany was to be defeated utterly, and feeding German civilians was secondary to the needs of Allied troops and liberated peoples. The policy known as JCS 1067, drafted to guide the occupation, specifically stated that Germany would not be occupied for the purpose of liberation, but as a defeated enemy state. Yet the reality on the ground proved far more complicated than policy documents suggested. When the 1st Infantry Division entered Cologne in early March, soldiers found a city of ghosts. Of more than 700,000 pre-war residents, fewer than 40,000 remained, huddled in cellars and ruins. Those who survived were living skeletons, subsisting on less than 1,000 calories per day. Children with swollen bellies and stick-thin limbs lined up outside American positions, their silent presence a more powerful argument than any appeal to military regulations. Captain John Thompson, a logistics officer with the 1st Division, recorded his first encounter with German civilians in his diary. "We entered the city expecting resistance, prepared for snipers and ambushes. Instead, we found only silence and hunger." An old woman approached our jeep, not begging, simply standing there with a dignity that made her starvation more unbearable. She held out a photograph of a young man in Wehrmacht uniform. Her son, I assumed, probably dead in Russia or France. She spoke no English and I no German, but her meaning was clear. She was asking if we were human enough to see past the uniform her son had worn. The moral weight of such encounters fell heavily on young Americans, who had been trained to see Germans as the enemy. Many of these soldiers were barely 20 years old, farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Pennsylvania, who had never traveled beyond their home states before the war. They had been told stories of Nazi atrocities, had seen the results of concentration camps, had lost friends to German bullets and shells. Yet here they stood, confronted with grandmothers and children whose guilt was difficult to assess and whose suffering was impossible to ignore. The situation was particularly acute in the Rhineland, where American forces had established their first major occupation zones. Cities like Aachen, the first German city to fall to Allied forces in October 1944, became laboratories for occupation policy. Initially, military government officers attempted to enforce strict non-fraternization rules, forbidding American soldiers from speaking to or assisting German civilians beyond official duties. But hunger knows no policy, and compassion recognizes no regulations. The scale of destruction varied across regions. Industrial centers like Essen and Dortmund had been systematically targeted by Allied bombers seeking to cripple German war production. These cities existed now as vast fields of rubble, punctuated by the skeletal remains of factories and residential buildings. In such environments, even locating survivors proved challenging. Many Germans lived in cellars, emerging only to search for food or water. Municipal services had ceased entirely. No electricity, no running water, no sanitation systems. The risk of epidemic disease was enormous. Rural areas presented different challenges. While physical destruction was less severe, these regions had been stripped of resources to feed German armies and cities. Livestock had been requisitioned, crops confiscated, young men conscripted. The elderly, women and children who remained struggled to maintain agricultural production with inadequate tools, draft animals and manpower. The collapse of transportation meant that even where food existed, it could not reach those who needed it most. The path that led American forces to feed their former enemies began long before the first GI handed a ration to a starving child. It was rooted in American military culture, in the values that had shaped the citizen soldiers of the U.S. Army, and in a tradition of humanitarian intervention that stretched back to the First World War. During World War I, Americans had witnessed European starvation firsthand. Herbert Hoover's relief operations had fed millions across the continent, earning the United States a reputation as the arsenal of mercy as well as the arsenal of democracy. That experience had shaped a generation of military and civilian leaders who understood that winning the war was only the first step toward winning the peace. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, had been a young officer during that earlier conflict. The lessons of that war, particularly the harsh Treaty of Versailles and the chaos that followed, informed his approach to occupation policy. But Eisenhower faced competing pressures. Public opinion in America was unforgiving toward Germany. The revelation of concentration camps and the full scope of the Holocaust had hardened hearts against any sympathy for German suffering. Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau had proposed a plan to deindustrialize Germany completely, reducing it to an agricultural state incapable of waging war. While the Morgenthau plan was never fully implemented, its spirit influenced early occupation directives. Germany was to be defeated so thoroughly that it could never threaten peace again. The soldiers on the ground, however, were not policymakers or strategists. They were young men far from home, carrying out orders while confronting situations their training had never prepared them for. Private James Rodriguez of the 9th Infantry Division described his first day occupying a small Rhineland town. "We set up headquarters in what used to be the mayor's office. Within an hour there was a crowd outside, not threatening, just waiting. Mostly women, old men and kids. Our CO told us to ignore them, that we weren't here to make friends. But you couldn't ignore them. One little girl, maybe 6 years old, just stood there watching us eat our rations. Didn't beg, didn't cry, just watched. I tried to give her my chocolate bar, and the sergeant knocked it out of my hand, said we had orders." Such scenes played out thousands of times across occupied Germany in those early weeks. The non-fraternization policy, designed to maintain military discipline and prevent sympathizing with the enemy, created an impossible moral position for soldiers who had been raised to help those in need. The policy prohibited everything from giving food to civilians to speaking with them except in official capacities. Violators faced court-martial and potential imprisonment. Yet the policy began to crumble almost immediately upon contact with reality. Medical officers raised alarms about typhus and other diseases that would spread if the civilian population continued to deteriorate. Military government officials warned that mass starvation would create chaos that would undermine occupation efforts. And individual soldiers, following consciences shaped by American values, began to quietly subvert the regulations. The turning point came not through official policy change, but through countless small acts of defiance. A sergeant would look the other way as his men distributed K-rations to children. A supply officer would report losses of food stocks that actually went to feeding German civilians. A chaplain would organize humanitarian missions under the guise of gathering intelligence. These violations of military regulations represented something profound, the assertion of human compassion over bureaucratic rigidity. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Sanders, a military government officer assigned to occupation duties, later reflected on this period. "We were trained to think of Germans as the enemy, and they were. But when you're looking at a child who hasn't eaten in 3 days, national identity becomes abstract. I had orders that said we were not responsible for German welfare beyond preventing disease and disorder. But what does that mean when a child is dying of starvation in front of you? Is it preventing disorder to let them die?" The orders assumed a clarity that reality refused to provide. The infrastructure for feeding German civilians essentially had to be built from scratch. Nazi authorities had abandoned their posts, leaving no one in charge of food distribution. Local bakeries had no flour, markets had no goods, and municipal authorities had no resources. American military government units found themselves not just occupying Germany, but administering it at the most basic level. This meant requisitioning remaining food supplies, establishing distribution centers, and creating ration card systems, all while officially maintaining that German welfare was not their responsibility. The situation varied dramatically by location. In rural areas, some food production continued, and starvation was less acute. But in the cities, particularly industrial centers that had been heavily bombed, conditions approached catastrophic. In Frankfurt, American soldiers found that civilians were subsisting on between 500 and 800 calories per day, less than half what was needed for basic survival. Children showed signs of kwashiorkor, the protein deficiency disease typically seen in famine regions. Elderly Germans were dying in their homes, too weak to seek help. Sergeant Robert O'Brien, serving with the 3rd Armored Division, kept a detailed account of his unit's occupation of a small city near Stuttgart. The first week was the hardest. We had orders not to feed the civilians, but everywhere we went, there they were. I saw mothers holding babies who were too weak to cry, old men who looked like they'd stepped out of photographs from concentration camps, skeletal, barely alive. Some of the guys started sharing their rations despite the orders. The officers knew but didn't stop it. I think they understood that some orders are impossible to follow if you want to remain human. The psychological impact on American soldiers of witnessing such widespread suffering cannot be overstated. Many had grown up during the Depression, had known hunger themselves or seen it in their communities. This shared experience of hardship created unexpected empathy, despite the adversarial relationship between occupier and occupied. Soldiers who had experienced deprivation in America during the 1930s recognized the desperation they saw in German faces and responded with understanding, born of personal memory. Corporal Anthony Marino, whose family had struggled through the Depression in New York, wrote to his sister, "I know these people supported Hitler. I know what Germany did. But when I see kids with that hollow look, the same look I remember from our neighborhood in '33, when nobody had work and families were going hungry, I can't just walk past." Dad taught us, you help people who need help, period. I don't think he'd want me to forget that just because we're in Germany. The role of African American soldiers in occupation duties presented its own ironies and complexities. Black troops, who had served in segregated units and faced discrimination within their own army, now found themselves in positions of authority over white German civilians. For many, this reversal of racial hierarchies was profound and complicated. Some felt satisfaction at the power dynamic, others discomfort at perpetuating any form of racial oppression, even against those who had supported a regime built on racial ideology. Sergeant Isaiah Washington of the 92nd Infantry Division reflected on these contradictions. Here I was, a black man from Mississippi, where I couldn't vote and had to use separate facilities, now telling white Germans what to do. Part of me enjoyed it, I won't lie, but I also saw that these people were suffering, that whatever satisfaction I got from the power dynamic didn't change the fact that kids were hungry. I figured the best way to represent my people was to show that black Americans could be both strong and compassionate, that we could wield power without abusing it the way power had been used against us. The documentation of civilian suffering became important as military government officers sought to justify humanitarian interventions to superiors and policymakers. Photographers and reporters embedded with occupation forces produced extensive evidence of conditions in occupied Germany. These images and reports, intended initially for military purposes, would eventually reach American audiences and influence public opinion about occupation policy. Lieutenant William Bradford, an intelligence officer, supervised documentation efforts in his sector. We photographed everything: the destroyed buildings, the displaced persons camps, the food lines, the hospitals. Initially, this was just standard intelligence gathering, documenting conditions for our reports. But I realized these images told a story that needed to be told. Americans needed to see what Germany looked like now, what defeating the enemy actually meant in human terms. Not to excuse what Germany had done, but to understand the situation we were dealing with and the choices we faced. The training that American soldiers had received also played a role in shaping their responses to civilian suffering. Unlike some military traditions that emphasized rigid obedience and emotional detachment, American military culture encouraged individual initiative and moral reasoning. Soldiers were taught that they represented their nation's values and should conduct themselves accordingly. This cultural framework, combined with religious education many had received, created internal resources soldiers could draw upon when confronting ethical dilemmas. Chaplain Thomas Fitzgerald, who served with the 4th Infantry Division, observed this dynamic. Many of our boys had been raised in churches that taught the parable of the Good Samaritan, that emphasized caring for those in need regardless of their identity. When they encountered starving Germans, these teachings came into conflict with military orders and their justified anger. But I saw again and again that their fundamental decency won out. They'd find ways to help that technically didn't violate orders, or they'd violate orders and accept the consequences. Their consciences wouldn't allow them to do otherwise. The crisis that unfolded across occupied Germany in the spring of 1945 revealed fundamental tensions at the heart of warfare and its aftermath. How does a democracy wage total war while maintaining its values? What obligations does a victor owe to a defeated enemy? Can justice and mercy coexist in the immediate aftermath of unprecedented atrocity? These questions had no easy answers, and the American response to German starvation illuminated contradictions that would define the post-war world. At the core was the concept of collective responsibility. German civilians had supported the Nazi regime, whether through active participation, passive acceptance, or simple failure to resist. They had cheered Hitler's victories, worked in armaments factories, and turned their backs as their Jewish neighbors were deported. The argument for harsh treatment was not without merit. Why should American resources feed those who had supported a regime responsible for the Holocaust? Why should compassion be extended to a population that had shown none? Yet this argument confronted a troubling reality. Children had not chosen the Nazi regime, had not voted for war, bore no responsibility for Holocaust atrocities. The elderly woman whose son died on the Eastern Front might have opposed Hitler, but had no power to prevent his rise. The concept of collective guilt, while emotionally satisfying, proved difficult to apply consistently when faced with individual human beings in desperate need. Captain William Hayes, a military government officer with legal training, wrestled with these questions in his official reports. We must distinguish between political responsibility and humanitarian necessity. Yes, the German people bear responsibility for the regime they allowed to take power. Yes, they benefited from conquest and turned blind eyes to atrocity. But if we allow children to starve to punish their parents' sins, what does that make us? If we apply collective punishment without distinguishing between individual Germans, are we not embracing the same logic of collective guilt that underlay Nazi ideology? The practical dimension of feeding German civilians intersected with strategic considerations. A starving population was an unstable population. prone to disease, disorder, and potentially communist agitation. Soviet forces advancing from the east had made feeding civilians a priority in their occupation zones, winning propaganda victories even as they committed widespread atrocities. American intelligence officers warned that failure to address the humanitarian crisis could push desperate Germans towards Soviet influence. But beyond strategy lay something more fundamental, a question of American identity. The United States had entered the war not merely to defeat fascism, but to defend a certain vision of human dignity and democratic values. American soldiers carried with them expectations shaped by their upbringing, that the strong protect the weak, that children deserve care regardless of their parents' sins, that even enemies deserve basic decency. These values had been reinforced through training, through chaplains' sermons, through letters from home reminding soldiers to be good representatives of America. The contradiction between official policy and individual conscience created a crisis for many soldiers. Private First Class Michael Chen, a Chinese-American soldier whose family had faced discrimination in California, found himself in the surreal position of feeding Germans while Japanese Americans remained in internment camps at home. I thought about my cousins in Manzanar while I was handing out food to German civilians. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, wearing an American uniform, treated better in occupied Germany than my family was treated in California. But that just made me more determined to do the right thing. If America was going to be what it claimed to be, it had to start somewhere. The experience of liberation complicated matters further. As American forces advanced, they had liberated concentration camps, Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. Soldiers had seen evidence of industrial murder, had encountered survivors barely alive, had walked through chambers designed for efficient killing. For men who had witnessed these horrors, extending mercy to Germans required enormous moral effort. Yet many found that compassion was not diminished by knowledge of atrocities, but rather deepened by it. Having seen what hatred could accomplish, they chose to respond with humanity. Corporal Thomas Wright, who had helped liberate a subcamp of Dachau, described his conflicted feelings. After what I saw in that camp, part of me wanted every German to suffer. I wanted them to feel what they'd done. But then I'd see a kid, maybe 8 years old, skinny as hell, and I'd think, this kid didn't do this. This kid is a victim too, just in a different way. And I realized that becoming cruel to punish cruelty just meant more cruelty in the world. Somebody had to break the cycle. The mechanics of feeding civilians also revealed much about American military culture. Unlike the highly centralized Soviet system, where orders flowed rigidly from top to bottom, the American military allowed significant initiative at lower levels. NCOs and junior officers could interpret orders, could find creative solutions to problems, could exercise judgment based on circumstances. This flexibility proved essential in addressing the humanitarian crisis because it allowed compassion to operate even when policy forbade it. Supply sergeants became particularly important in this unofficial effort. They controlled access to food stocks and could determine what was surplus and what was essential for military needs. Many simply redefined surplus generously, ensuring that excess rations found their way to civilian distribution points. This required creative bookkeeping and occasional disregard for regulations, but it represented a grassroots humanitarian effort that operated below the level of official policy. Master Sergeant Donald Fletcher, a supply NCO with the 82nd Airborne, explained his approach. The way I figured it, my job was to make sure my guys were fed and supplied. That was priority one. But we always seemed to have more than we needed because supply chains overcompensated. So when a German aid organization asked for help, I'd look at what we had and think about what I could spare. Maybe I reported some wastage that didn't actually happen. Maybe I was overly generous in estimating spoilage, but kids got fed and my unit stayed supplied, so I sleep fine at night. The question of German women's role in occupation dynamics deserves particular attention. With most German men dead, imprisoned, or missing, women became the primary intermediaries between occupation forces and civilian population. This created complex power dynamics, with German women often bearing the burden of securing resources for their families through interaction with occupying soldiers. Some American troops exploited this vulnerability, demanding sexual favors in exchange for food or protection. Others respected German women's dignity, even while maintaining necessary distance. Captain Eleanor Morrison, one of the few female officers involved in military government work, observed these dynamics with concern. The desperation of German women made them vulnerable to exploitation, and some of our men took advantage. But I also saw tremendous courage. Women who maintained their dignity despite having lost everything, who organized community kitchens and orphanages with whatever resources they could scrape together. They were victims of their government's choices, but also agents trying to protect their families and rebuild their communities. We had to navigate between helping them and not creating dependencies or situations open to abuse. The children of occupied Germany represented both the most sympathetic victims and the future that occupation policy sought to shape. American authorities recognized that how German children were treated would influence what kind of adults they became and what kind of nation Germany would be. Feeding children was thus both humanitarian necessity and strategic investment. Schools became important sites for this effort, with American military government establishing feeding programs that ensured children received at least one substantial meal per day. Major Richard Thompson, who supervised educational affairs in Bavaria, explained the rationale. We're not just feeding these kids to keep them alive today. We're teaching them that democracy provides, that American values mean something concrete. A child who receives food and education from American authorities learns that there are alternatives to fascism, that systems built on different principles can deliver better results. These children are Germany's future, and we're shaping what they believe about the world. The role of guilt in German civilian responses to American aid varied considerably. Some Germans expressed gratitude mixed with shame, acknowledging their nation's crimes while accepting necessary help. Others maintained they had known nothing of atrocities, positioning themselves as victims of Nazi deception. Still others showed entitlement, expecting Americans to provide for them as if occupation carried obligations without reference to Germany's responsibility for the war. American soldiers encountered all these attitudes and had to navigate responses accordingly. Sergeant Paul Jenkins described the range of reactions. You'd get every kind of response. Some Germans would thank you with tears in their eyes, clearly understanding the mercy they were being shown. Others acted like we owed them something, like it was our job to take care of them now that Germany had lost. The ones who bothered me most were those who claimed they'd never supported Hitler, never knew what was happening. Where were all these opponents when the Nazis were winning? But I couldn't let my frustration with their denial stop me from feeding hungry kids. That would just punish the wrong people. The generational divide among German civilians also shaped interactions with American forces. Older Germans who remembered the First World War and the chaos that followed often approached occupation with resignation, tinged with relief that the fighting had ended. Middle-aged Germans who had been adults during the Nazi rise to power bore more direct responsibility and showed more varied responses. Young adults who had come of age under Hitler often remained ideologically committed even in defeat, though hunger and exhaustion tempered their resistance. Children, innocent of political decisions, evoked the most sympathy. These generational differences created tactical challenges for occupation forces. Should former Hitler Youth members, teenagers who had been indoctrinated from childhood, be treated as victims or perpetrators? How should authorities handle young women who had served in auxiliary roles supporting the Wehrmacht? These questions required nuanced judgments that acknowledged both individual circumstances and systemic participation in Nazi crimes. The transformation of American policy from strict non-fraternization to active humanitarian intervention did not happen through a single directive or policy change. Instead, it evolved through the accumulation of practical necessities, moral imperatives, and the recognition that sustainable occupation required addressing basic human needs. The first significant shift came through medical channels. Army medical officers recognized that disease respects no boundaries between military and civilian populations. Typhus, tuberculosis, and other diseases flourishing in the malnourished German population posed direct threats to American forces. Colonel Albert Buckley, Chief Medical Officer for the 7th Corps, submitted a report in late March 1945 that would prove influential. The humanitarian concerns aside, allowing the civilian population to deteriorate creates a disease reservoir that threatens our troops. Malnutrition compromises immune systems, creating conditions for epidemics. We cannot maintain the health of our forces while ignoring the health crisis among civilians in occupied territories. Medical necessity demands intervention. This argument proved persuasive, because it framed humanitarian assistance as a military necessity. Commanders who might have hesitated to divert resources for German welfare could justify the same actions as force protection. Food distribution to German civilians became not an act of charity, but a preventive health measure. The semantic shift was crucial. It allowed policy to align with what many soldiers were already doing unofficially. The establishment of organized relief operations began in April 1945, as the military situation stabilized and occupation became the primary mission. The U.S. Army established the Civil Affairs Division with expanded authority to address civilian needs. Working with international relief organizations, military government units began systematic efforts to feed German civilians, starting with the most vulnerable populations: children, pregnant women, and the elderly. Lieutenant Anna Morrison, one of the first female officers assigned to civilian relief operations, described the organizational challenge. We had to build everything from nothing. There were no food distribution systems, no records of who needed help, no infrastructure for delivering aid. We started by identifying community leaders who could help organize local distribution, former teachers, priests, doctors, anyone with credibility who could help us reach those most in need. We established feeding stations, starting with children because they were both most vulnerable and least responsible for the war. The program faced enormous logistical challenges. Transportation networks remained damaged, making it difficult to move supplies. Local Germans often lacked the organizational capacity to manage distribution effectively. Determining fair ration levels required balancing limited resources against desperate need. And always, there was the political question of whether feeding Germans deprived liberated peoples or allied populations who had their own shortages. Captain David Rosenberg, a Jewish officer whose extended family had perished in the Holocaust, became an unlikely advocate for German relief. His perspective offered powerful moral clarity. My family is dead because of what happened here. Nothing will change that. But if I let children starve because of rage over what was done to my family, then I'm perpetuating the same logic that killed them, that some lives matter less than others based on their group identity. The answer to genocide is not more suffering, but the affirmation that every life has value. That's what my family would have wanted me to believe. The practical implementation varied across occupation zones. In some areas, military government officers worked with German civic leaders to restart municipal services, including food distribution systems. In others, the military directly controlled all aid, using it to enforce compliance with occupation directives. Some commanders were generous, others minimal in their interpretation of requirements. But gradually, a system emerged that prevented mass starvation, even if it could not immediately restore normal nutrition levels. Religious organizations played a crucial role in bridging the gap between military policy and humanitarian need. Catholic and Protestant chaplains often took the lead in organizing relief efforts, their moral authority providing cover for activities that might otherwise have violated regulations. Chaplain Richard O'Connor, a Catholic priest serving with the First Army, became known for his work establishing orphanages and soup kitchens. The Church teaches that we have obligations to all human beings, regardless of nationality or past actions. These children needed help, and I had the means to provide it. Whether doing so aligned with military regulations was secondary to whether it aligned with moral obligations. I told any officer who questioned me that I answered to a higher authority than the U.S. Army. The involvement of German civilians themselves was crucial to making relief efforts work. Despite years of Nazi propaganda painting Americans as brutal occupiers, many Germans were surprised by the compassion they encountered. Women who had fled Soviet forces in the East brought horror stories that made American occupation seem merciful by comparison. This created opportunities for cooperation, with German civilians helping to identify those most in need and participating in distribution efforts. Margarete Hoffmann, a former school teacher who worked with American forces in Frankfurt, later recalled, "We expected the worst from the Americans. We had been told they would be as brutal as we feared the Russians were. Instead, they treated us like human beings. They were strict, yes, and they did not forget what Germany had done. But they did not seek revenge through starvation. When I saw American soldiers giving chocolate to children, I began to understand that not all victors are the same." The question of German agency became important as occupation continued. The Allied policy of denazification meant that former Nazi Party members were excluded from positions of authority, but this created problems when experienced administrators were needed to manage relief operations. Military government officers had to balance the need for effective administration against the imperative to remove those compromised by association with the Nazi regime. Often, the solution was pragmatic: use available German expertise while maintaining American oversight and control. By May 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender, the humanitarian situation stabilized somewhat. The end of combat meant resources could be redirected to civilian relief. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, began operations in occupied Germany, supplementing military efforts with international aid. Food shipments arrived from the United States, Britain, and other allied nations, though never in sufficient quantity to restore pre-war nutrition levels. The American approach to feeding German civilians contrasted sharply with Soviet methods in the eastern zones. While both powers ultimately prevented mass starvation, the Soviet emphasis on political control and collective punishment created harsher conditions. Stories of American generosity spread, creating goodwill that would prove valuable as Cold War tensions emerged. The decision to feed former enemies became an investment in future relationships, though that strategic benefit was largely unintended at the time. Coordination between different occupation authorities presented ongoing challenges. The British, French, and Soviet zones operated under different policies and with different resources. The French, having suffered German occupation themselves and facing their own food shortages, were particularly reluctant to divert resources to feeding Germans. The British, while more generous, lacked American abundance and struggled to provide adequate supplies. Only the Americans had both the resources and the political will to undertake large-scale feeding operations. Colonel Howard Bennett, who served as liaison between American and British occupation authorities, described the coordination difficulties. The Brits wanted to help, but they were stretched thin. Britain itself was on rations and had suffered terribly from the war. The French were openly hostile to the idea of feeding Germans. They felt Germans should experience the deprivation France had suffered under occupation. The Russians claimed to be feeding civilians, but were actually extracting resources from their zones. We ended up carrying most of the burden because we could afford to, and because it aligned with American values and interests. The development of specialized feeding programs targeted specific vulnerable groups. Pregnant women received supplemental rations to ensure healthy births. Nursing mothers got extra provisions to maintain milk production. The elderly, often overlooked in initial distribution efforts, were eventually included in expanded programs. These targeted interventions reflected growing sophistication in understanding nutritional needs and humanitarian principles. Dr. Helen Crawford, a nutritionist assigned to military government, helped design these programs. We couldn't just distribute food randomly. We needed to understand who was most at risk and what nutrients they most needed. Children required protein for growth. Pregnant women needed calcium and vitamins. The elderly needed easily digestible foods their weakened systems could process. We applied public health principles to humanitarian relief, treating the whole population as patients requiring specific interventions. The psychological dimension of food aid proved as important as the nutritional. For Germans who had lost everything, homes, family members, their nation's future, receiving aid from former enemies carried profound meaning. It suggested that redemption was possible, that they were not permanently cast out from human community, that their children had a future beyond the rubble of defeat. This psychological rehabilitation complemented the physical rehabilitation that food provided. Innovation in distribution methods emerged from necessity. Mobile kitchens brought hot meals to areas where infrastructure had been completely destroyed. School feeding programs ensured children received nutrition while also encouraging educational participation. Community gardens were established to supplement rations and teach self-sufficiency. These programs demonstrated that humanitarian relief could be both immediate response to crisis and investment in long-term recovery. The American response to German starvation, while ultimately humanitarian, was far from perfect and raised difficult questions that remain relevant today. Critics pointed to inconsistencies, delays, and the troubling reality that food aid to Germans often came at the expense of other populations who had suffered under Nazi occupation. The most serious criticism concerned priorities. While American soldiers fed German civilians, Displaced persons from across Europe languished in camps with inadequate supplies. Jewish survivors of concentration camps, Polish forced laborers, French deportees, and others who had been victims of Nazi aggression sometimes received less assistance than German civilians. This seemed to invert moral priorities, rewarding perpetrators while neglecting victims. Rachel Goldman, a Jewish aid worker with the Joint Distribution Committee, expressed frustration with these priorities. "I watched American soldiers hand out rations to German women who had probably watched their Jewish neighbors being deported without protest, while 2 miles away, concentration camp survivors were eating the same meager rations. The Germans who created this catastrophe were being fed before those they had victimized. I understood the humanitarian necessity, but the moral calculus felt deeply wrong." This criticism highlighted a genuine problem with early relief efforts. Resources were limited, and choices had to be made about allocation. The decision to prevent German starvation was sound, but it should not have come at the expense of displaced persons and camp survivors. The fact that it sometimes did reflected logistical challenges rather than malicious intent, but the result was nonetheless unjust. Only as supply chains improved could adequate support reach all vulnerable populations. Another line of criticism came from those who felt that any aid to Germans was inappropriate given their collective responsibility for the war. This argument, popular in some quarters of American public opinion, held that Germans should experience the consequences of their support for Hitler. Allowing them to suffer was not cruelty, but justice, making them pay for their crimes in the most direct way possible. Senator Burton Wheeler of Montana gave voice to this position in a speech before Congress. "Let us not forget that these are the people who cheered Hitler's armies as they marched through Poland, who benefited from stolen goods plundered from across Europe, who turned their backs while millions were murdered. American boys died liberating Europe from the tyranny these Germans supported. Now we're asked to feed them with American resources. There must be some accountability for what was done." This position had emotional force, but confronted practical and moral objections. Practically, allowing mass starvation would create chaos that would undermine occupation efforts and potentially lead to disease and disorder threatening American forces. Morally, collective punishment that made no distinction between individuals violated principles that Americans claimed to uphold. If German guilt was collective and heritable, passing to children who had no agency in Nazi crimes, then American values regarding individual responsibility and justice were meaningless. The inconsistency in American policy also drew criticism. The Non-Fraternization Directive remained officially in force even as humanitarian aid expanded, creating cognitive dissonance for soldiers expected to help Germans while not associating with them. This contradiction made enforcement impossible and led to uneven application of rules, depending on individual commanders' interpretations. Some units maintained strict separation, others effectively abandoned the policy. The inconsistency created confusion and undermined military discipline. Furthermore, the effectiveness of aid distribution varied dramatically. In well-organized zones with competent military government officers, relief reached those who needed it most. In other areas, chaos and lack of coordination meant supplies were wasted, stolen, or distributed inequitably. Some German civilians manipulated the system, obtaining multiple ration cards or hoarding supplies. Others, particularly those in rural areas or without connections, received little assistance despite desperate need. Staff Sergeant Vincent Torres, who supervised distribution in a Bavarian town, described the challenges. "We tried to be fair, but how do you ensure fairness when records don't exist and everyone has an incentive to lie? People claimed to be refugees to get extra rations. They hid family members to collect more cards. We did our best to verify stories, but we had limited resources and language barriers. I'm sure some who really needed help didn't get it, while others who were managing fine worked the system successfully." The question of whether aid constituted absolution for German sins troubled some observers. By helping Germans, were Americans suggesting that the past could be forgiven, that humanitarian need erased moral debt? Some argued that aid should be explicitly conditional, requiring Germans to acknowledge crimes and demonstrate contrition before receiving assistance. Others felt that making hungry children political bargaining chips was itself immoral. This debate reflected deeper questions about justice and reconciliation. Could there be forgiveness without accountability? Did providing food constitute forgiveness, Or was it simply recognition of shared humanity that transcended political considerations? These philosophical questions had no easy answers, and different individuals came to different conclusions. Chaplain Michael Donnelly, who worked extensively with both German civilians and displaced persons, offered one perspective. Feeding someone is not the same as forgiving them. It's recognizing that every human being deserves basic dignity, regardless of what they've done. We can acknowledge German responsibility for atrocities, while also acknowledging that children need food. These are not contradictory positions. Justice for past crimes and mercy for present suffering can coexist. In fact, they must coexist if we want to build a better future. The long-term consequences of the American response also merited examination. By preventing mass starvation and treating German civilians relatively humanely, American forces created goodwill that proved strategically valuable during the Cold War. West Germany became a reliable ally, in part because Germans remembered American occupation more favorably than Soviet brutality in the East. But this positive outcome raised uncomfortable questions. Did humanitarian treatment constitute a reward for aggression? Would potential future aggressors conclude that defeat would not be so terrible if victors were merciful? These concerns proved largely unfounded. The humanitarian treatment of Germans did not encourage future aggression because it was paired with genuine accountability through trials, denazification, and the complete dismantling of German military capacity. Mercy in one domain did not preclude justice in others. The example set by American occupation suggested that victors could be both just and merciful, could hold aggressors accountable while treating civilian populations humanely. Comparing the American approach to other models of occupation proved instructive. The Soviet occupation of Eastern Germany combined ideological indoctrination with economic exploitation and significant brutality, particularly toward women. This created lasting resentment and failed to win German allegiance. The British and French occupations fell somewhere between American and Soviet approaches, constrained by their own post-war resource limitations and bitter memories of German occupation during the war. The American approach, characterized by relative restraint and increasing humanitarian focus, proved most successful at converting former enemies into allies. This was not primarily due to calculated strategy, but rather emerged from American soldiers, acting according to their values when confronted with human suffering. The policymakers in Washington often lagged behind the soldiers in the field, eventually codifying as policy what troops had already been doing informally. The racial dimensions of occupation deserve critical examination as well. While American forces generally treated German civilians more humanely than they might have treated non-white populations, this reflected the racial hierarchies of the era. Would American soldiers have shown similar compassion toward Japanese civilians had circumstances been different? The fact that this question arises reveals uncomfortable truths about how race influenced humanitarian responses, even within supposedly universal frameworks. Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, an African-American officer who later wrote extensively about his occupation experiences, noted this dimension. There's no question that race mattered in how Americans treated Germans. We saw them as white Europeans, as people fundamentally like us despite being enemies. I'm not convinced we would have shown the same compassion toward Asian populations. The fact that we could recognize Germans' humanity, while many Americans still denied full humanity to black citizens in our own country, reveals the selective nature of our compassion. The experience also raised questions about military professionalism and civilian control. When soldiers systematically violated non-fraternization policies to feed civilians, they were asserting moral judgment over military orders. While the outcome was positive in this case, the precedent was potentially troubling. What happens when soldiers' moral judgments lead them to violate legitimate orders? The balance between following orders and maintaining ethical standards remains a fundamental tension in military service. The spring and summer of 1945 marked a turning point, not just in the war, but in conceptions of how victors treat the vanquished. The American soldiers who fed German civilians, often in defiance of regulations and contrary to their own justified anger, demonstrated something profound about the capacity for compassion even in the immediate aftermath of total war. Their actions were not naive or soft. These were men who had fought through some of history's bloodiest battles, who had witnessed Nazi atrocities firsthand, who had every reason to hate the people they were now helping. Their compassion was earned through experience, not innocent of evil but consciously chosen despite awareness of it. The German civilians who broke down in gratitude when American soldiers stopped the starvation were responding to more than just food. They were confronting a reality that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had told them about their enemies. The Americans, who were supposed to be brutal occupiers, instead revealed themselves as human beings capable of mercy. This cognitive dissonance shattered propaganda's hold and opened possibilities for reconciliation that might otherwise have been impossible. Martha Schneider, who was 12 years old when American forces occupied her village, recalled decades later, "I remember the first time an American soldier gave me chocolate. I had been taught to fear them, to expect cruelty. Instead, this young man, probably not much older than my brother who had died in Russia, smiled and handed me something precious. I did not understand his words, but I understood his gesture. In that moment, I learned that propaganda lies, that enemies can be kind, that the world is more complicated than hate allows. That chocolate bar probably saved my life, but more importantly, it saved my capacity to hope." The legacy of this moment extended far beyond immediate humanitarian relief. The choice to feed former enemies rather than allow them to starve set a precedent for post-war reconstruction. The Marshall Plan, which would pour billions into rebuilding Western Europe, including former enemy nations, emerged from recognition that stability required addressing human needs, even among those who had been adversaries. The decision to help Germany recover economically and politically created the conditions for lasting peace and European integration. But perhaps most importantly, the actions of American soldiers in the spring of 1945 affirmed a principle that transcends strategic calculations, that basic human dignity is not contingent on national identity or past actions, that children deserve food regardless of their parents' sins, that compassion is not weakness, but strength. These soldiers could have allowed hatred to govern their actions. Many had lost friends to German weapons, had seen concentration camps, had every justification for cruelty. Instead, they chose to feed hungry children. This choice was not universally popular. Letters to soldiers from home sometimes expressed outrage that Americans would help Germans. Some veterans felt betrayed when resources went to former enemies. The policy of humanitarian intervention faced criticism from multiple directions, from those who felt it was too generous to Germans, and from those who felt it came too late and was too limited. Yet despite criticism and controversy, the policy endured because it aligned with fundamental American values. Staff Sergeant James Mitchell, who had landed on D-Day and fought across France and Germany, reflected on his experiences in a letter written 50 years later. "I did things in the war I'm not proud of. I killed men who were probably just following orders like I was. I saw friends die and could do nothing to save them. War made me harder, angrier, more capable of violence than I ever imagined. But when I saw those starving kids in Germany, something in me refused to become completely hard. I'd fought to defeat evil, but I hadn't fought to become evil myself. Feeding those children was my way of reclaiming my humanity after months of organized inhumanity. It wasn't about them, not really. It was about me, about staying human in inhuman circumstances." The emotional impact on German civilians who experienced American mercy cannot be overstated. For many, it represented a first encounter with the values Americans claimed to represent: democracy, individual dignity, rule of law tempered by compassion. These encounters planted seeds that would grow into West Germany's democratic culture, its integration into Western institutions, its evolution into one of America's closest allies. Klaus Hartmann, who became a prominent German politician in the post-war period, traced his political philosophy to experiences as a teenager during American occupation. "I learned what democracy meant, not from textbooks, but from American soldiers who treated me as a human being despite knowing what Germany had done. They could have been tyrants. We deserved it. Instead, they were strict but fair, demanding but decent. They showed me that power could be exercised without cruelty, that justice did not require vengeance. Those lessons shaped everything I later did in public service." The contrast with Soviet occupation in Eastern Germany reinforced the impact of American humanity. Stories circulated of Red Army brutality, of mass rapes and deportations, of harsh treatment that confirmed Nazi propaganda's warnings about Bolshevism. These stories were often exaggerated, but contained enough truth to make German civilians grateful for American rather than Soviet occupation. This gratitude had strategic consequences during the Cold War, facilitating West Germany's integration into NATO and its emergence as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. Yet it would be dishonest to conclude without acknowledging the complexity and imperfection of this history. American soldiers' compassion toward German civilians coexisted with ongoing racial segregation in the military itself, with prejudice against German civilians despite humanitarian efforts, with policies that sometimes prioritized Germans over displaced persons who had suffered under Nazi rule. The same army that fed German children maintained separate units for black soldiers, denied them equal opportunity, and subjected them to discrimination. American occupation was more humane than alternatives, but it was not without moral failings. The story of Americans feeding Germans in 1945 is not a simple tale of good versus evil or of American innocence transforming German guilt. It is rather a story about the capacity for compassion within a framework of war and occupation, about individual choices that transcended policy, about the hard work of remaining human when circumstances encourage inhumanity. It reminds us that even in war's aftermath, even when facing those who supported evil, there is room for mercy alongside justice. Private First Class. Robert Anderson, in his final letter home before returning to the United States, captured something essential about this experience. "Mom, you asked me if I forgave the Germans for what they did, if I felt okay helping them after losing Jack in the Bulge. I don't think forgiveness is the right word. I'll never forget what happened, and they need to answer for their crimes, but I couldn't watch children starve, couldn't turn my back on grandmothers who reminded me of you. Maybe that makes me soft, but I don't think so. I think it means I went to war and came back still capable of compassion. That's the victory I'm most proud of, not the battles we won, but the humanity we kept." The American soldiers who stopped German starvation in 1945 were not saints or perfect moral exemplars. They were ordinary people, thrust into extraordinary circumstances, who chose compassion over cruelty when both were available options. Their legacy extends beyond the immediate humanitarian impact to influence how democratic societies think about war's aftermath, about obligations to defeated enemies, about the relationship between justice and mercy. 80 years later, as conflicts continue around the world and questions of occupation and reconstruction remain relevant, the lessons of 1945 endure. They remind us that winning the war is only the beginning, that how victors treat the vanquished shapes the peace that follows, that compassion is not weakness, but strategic wisdom as well as moral imperative. The German civilians who broke down in gratitude when American troops stopped the starvation were not just expressing relief at survival. They were witnessing and responding to values in action, the demonstration that American democracy meant something beyond rhetoric, that the soldiers who liberated Europe carried with them not just military might, but moral commitments that survived even total war's brutalizing effects. In the rubble of German cities in 1945, in the mundane act of handing food to hungry children, American soldiers wrote a chapter of their nation's story that deserves remembering. They showed that it is possible to hold enemies accountable while treating them humanely, to achieve justice while practicing mercy, to wage war with determined ferocity while retaining the capacity for compassion when the guns fall silent. That legacy, imperfect, complicated, but ultimately redemptive, stands as testament to what is possible when military necessity meets moral courage, when policy yields to conscience, when ordinary people choose to affirm human dignity even when circumstances would excuse its denial. The children who received chocolate bars and bread from American soldiers grew up to build a democratic Germany, to become allies rather than enemies, to teach their own children about the possibilities of reconciliation. The soldiers who fed them went home carrying lessons about themselves, that they had been tested by war and had not broken completely, that they had done terrible things in service of a just cause but had not become terrible people, that compassion and strength could coexist. Both groups carried forward the memory of a moment when humanity transcended hatred, when mercy tempered justice, when former enemies recognized each other as human beings sharing fundamental needs and deserving basic dignity. This is what warriors remembered when they recalled the spring of 1945, not just the military victory, but the moral victory of remaining human despite everything war had done to make them otherwise. The German civilians who cried, "They saved our children," were right in more ways than they knew. The food prevented starvation, but the compassion behind it saved something more precious, the possibility of believing again in human goodness after years of experiencing and witnessing its absence. That double salvation, of bodies and spirits, of victims and victors alike, remains the most powerful legacy of that moment, when American troops stopped the starvation, and in doing so, stopped the cycle of hatred that war breeds. The transformation that occurred in those months cannot be reduced to policy decisions or strategic calculations. It emerged from thousands of individual encounters between American soldiers and German civilians, moments when shared humanity overcame political divisions, when compassion proved stronger than hatred, when the impulse to help outweighed the desire for revenge. These moments, small in themselves, accumulated into something historically significant, a model of occupation that balanced accountability with mercy, that proved victors need not be vindictive to be effective, that demonstrated how former enemies might become future allies. The infrastructure of mercy that American forces built in occupied Germany, the feeding stations and orphanages, the medical clinics and schools, the systems for distributing aid fairly and efficiently, represented more than humanitarian relief. It constituted a practical education in democracy for both occupiers and occupied. German civilians learned that democratic systems could deliver tangible benefits, that American promises had substance beyond propaganda. American soldiers learned that their nation's ideals could be implemented even in difficult circumstances, that doing the right thing was possible even when it was hard. This mutual education laid groundwork for the remarkable transformation of US-German relations over subsequent decades. The Federal Republic of Germany would become one of America's most important allies, a partnership built on shared values and mutual respect. That partnership had many foundations: Cold War necessity, economic interests, political alignments, but among them was the memory of American compassion in Germany's darkest hour. The soldiers who fed starving Germans in 1945 could not have foreseen this outcome, but their choices helped make it possible. The story carries forward into our present moment, offering lessons for contemporary conflicts and occupations. It demonstrates that humanitarian considerations need not undermine military effectiveness, that treating civilian populations with dignity can advance strategic objectives, that the moral high ground is not merely rhetorical, but practically valuable. Modern military doctrine increasingly recognizes these truths, incorporating humanitarian concerns into operational planning in ways that would have surprised military leaders of earlier eras. Yet the story also reminds us of enduring tensions between justice and mercy, between holding perpetrators accountable and addressing innocent suffering, between following orders and following conscience. These tensions have no permanent resolution. Each generation, each conflict, each moment of choice requires individuals to navigate them anew. The American soldiers of 1945 offer not a blueprint, but an example of how such navigation might proceed when guided by values that recognize both human fallibility and human dignity.